"You ruin everything you touch," my mother said as she threw my paintings in the trash. I left home that night and never looked back. Years later, she was invited to a private auction. When the final piece was unveiled, she froze. The host whispered, "This one's called Mother's Criticism, and it's priced at $2 million. In the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, Ellie Porter had spent the better part of her 27 years perfecting the art of invisibility. Working as an archivist at the city's historical museum, she catalogued artifacts from colonial times to the Civil War, hiding herself among the dusty shelves and forgotten manuscripts. Her days passed quietly, predictably, in the cool dimness of the archives, far from the buzzing energy of the outside world. But Ellie harbored a secret that pulsed in her chest like a second heartbeat, a passion she had kept buried for fear it would never be understood. Ever since she was a teenager, she had been obsessed with fire dancing. She had first seen it at a summer festival when she was 15, mesmerized by the flames spinning in synchronized arcs, casting golden light onto the enchanted faces of the crowd. Since that night, Ellie had taught herself the art in secrecy, practicing in the backyard of her childhood home, using makeshift poi, and watching online tutorials long after midnight. She never told her parents, who were conservative and wary of anything they deemed reckless. Her father, a retired Marine, believed in discipline, rules, and stability. Her mother, a schoolteacher, expected Ellie to pursue a path that was safe and practical. Fire dancing was neither, so Ellie kept it to herself, mastering the movements alone, whispering her passion into the night air as flames danced around her like spirits called from the dark. Every weekend, when the city's rhythm slowed, Ellie would sneak out to the secluded shore of Folly Beach, where the moonlight bathed the sand in silver and the waves sang in soft cadence. There, under the stars, she would light her poi and let them spin, the fire reflecting in her eyes, her body swaying with the ocean breeze. It was the only place she felt real, felt seen, even if only by the stars. But life, as it often does, was about to disrupt her carefully guarded world. One Thursday afternoon, as Ellie sorted through a newly donated collection of Civil War letters, the museum director, Mr. Langford, tapped her shoulder. "You've got a visitor," he said, voice low with curiosity. "Says he's from the Charleston Gazette. Wants to interview someone about the rare ledger you discovered last month." Ellie stiffened. She hated attention. The ledger had been an accidental find, an old plantation account book with cryptic notes in the margins, possibly alluding to a hidden slave route. It had made waves in the historical community, but Ellie had dodged every request for comment. Until now. In the front gallery stood a man she didn't recognize, early 30s, tall, dressed in dark jeans and a casual button-down. His hair was a bit too long to be polished, but his eyes were sharp and curious. "Hi. You must be Ellie Porter," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dean Caldwell. I write for the Gazette's Cultural Heritage series." Ellie hesitated before shaking his hand. His grip was warm, confident. "I don't usually do interviews," she said softly, trying not to look directly into his eyes. "That's all right," he replied with a half-smile. "But you found something important. I think people would like to hear your perspective. I promise not to be intrusive." Against her better judgment, Ellie agreed. They sat in the museum cafe, and for the next hour Dean asked questions, not just about the ledger, but about her work, her interests, what drew her to history. Ellie found herself talking more than she expected. Dean had a way of listening that made her feel unguarded, as though he could peel back her layers without effort. At the end of the interview, he thanked her, paused, and said, "You've got a quiet kind of passion, Ellie. It shows." She blinked. No one had ever said that to her before. She returned to the archives unsettled, her mind spinning faster than her fire poi ever had. That night, she didn't go to the beach. Instead, she lay awake, wondering if Dean had seen more than she had meant to show. Days passed, and she assumed the moment had ended there. But the article came out the following Wednesday, accompanied by a photo of Ellie standing beside the ledger, looking almost statuesque. Dean had painted her not just as a dedicated archivist, but as someone who brought history to life with quiet brilliance. The staff buzzed with compliments. Even Mr. Langford was impressed. Ellie wanted to hide, but something else stirred inside her too. For once, someone had seen her, not just the mask she wore. That feeling stayed with her as the weekend approached. That Saturday night, as she walked toward Folly Beach with her poi tucked under her arm, she noticed something different. Someone was already there, a silhouette leaning against a driftwood log, her breath caught as she drew closer. Dean Caldwell stood watching the sea. "You really shouldn't sneak up on people with fire equipment," he said without turning. Ellie froze. "How did you—" He smiled. "I followed a hunch." Silence fell between them as the waves lapped the shore. "Show me," he said softly. Ellie hesitated. No one had ever seen her dance. But the moon was high, and the wind whispered through the dunes like an invitation. So she lit the poi. The flames roared to life, and Ellie began to move. Slow at first, then faster, the fire tracing arcs in the air as her body flowed with instinct and grace. Dean watched in awe, his expression unreadable, as if he was witnessing something sacred. When she stopped, breathless and glowing, he stepped forward. "You're more than an archivist," he said. Ellie looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't tell anyone." He smiled. Not a word. But deep down, Ellie knew the secret was no longer hers alone, and everything was about to change. The morning after the encounter on Folly Beach, Ellie awoke with a sense of unease she couldn't quite name. She stared at the ceiling of her modest apartment, where sunlight painted soft rectangles on the cracked plaster, and tried to untangle the rush of thoughts swirling in her mind. For years her world had been neat and silent, an orderly existence curated like the exhibits in the museum. Now, in a single night, everything had tilted, and a stranger named Dean Caldwell had become the axis. At the museum, her routine resumed with deceptive normalcy. She catalogued a collection of old portraits, adjusted temperature monitors in the archive room, and drank coffee that tasted more like cardboard than caffeine. But her hands trembled slightly when she handled the fragile documents, and her thoughts kept drifting to the night before. She replayed every flicker of the firelight, every word Dean had said, every glance exchanged beneath the stars. She had shared a part of herself that no one had ever seen, and he had watched without judgment, only awe. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a delivery envelope arrived at the front desk, addressed in careful handwriting to Eleanor Porter. Ellie rarely received personal correspondence at work. Curious, she opened it quietly in the back room. Inside was a single cream-colored card, thick and elegant. The edges were embossed with gold. At the center, her name was printed beneath a message. "You are cordially invited to perform at the Solstice Gala Saturday night at the Charleston Glasshouse Conservatory. An evening of light and celebration awaits." There was no sender's name, but at the bottom of the card was a note written in pen. "I hope you'll say yes. D." Ellie's stomach flipped. The Solstice Gala was one of Charleston's most exclusive events. A luminous night of art, music, and performance, attended by city officials, artists, patrons, and socialites. The thought of performing in front of hundreds of strangers in gowns and tuxedos sent a jolt of terror through her. And yet, part of her felt drawn toward the invitation, with a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. She folded the card and slipped it into her bag. That evening, she returned to the beach, but not to dance. She sat on the driftwood where Dean had stood, the sea wind tugging at her hair, and stared into the dark horizon. Could she really step out of the shadows? Could she allow the secret she had protected for so long to become something real, something witnessed? 2 days passed. She didn't respond. Then, on Wednesday morning, Dean appeared at the museum once again. This time he didn't ask for an interview. He waited by the front entrance, hat in hand, until she noticed him. She met him outside, the sun too bright on the stone steps. "You got the invitation?" he said. "I did," Ellie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know it's a leap, but I saw something in you that night. You belong in the light, Ellie, not just in the archives." She looked down, her fingers curling into her sleeves. "I'm not a performer." "Then don't perform," he said simply. "Just dance, like you do on the beach, that's all." His words struck a chord so deep, she felt breathless. For a long moment they stood in silence, the traffic of Meeting Street humming in the background. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "That's all I can ask." That night she didn't go to the beach. Instead, she stood in her small living room with the lights off, watching her reflection in the glass as she spun her unlit poi. She imagined the flames, the rush of heat, the hush of a mesmerized crowd. Her heart raced. She had danced alone for 12 years. What would it mean to be seen? On Friday, she called in sick to work. Instead, she visited the conservatory, an enormous glass structure nestled in a private botanical garden on the city's southern edge. She had never stepped inside before. The manager, a woman named Isabel, greeted her with polite enthusiasm, clearly expecting her. Dean had already paved the way. Ellie walked the perimeter of the stage, her boots echoing on the marble floor, and imagined the space filled with light, music, and eyes watching her every move. She shivered, not from fear but anticipation. By the time she returned home, she had made up her mind. She spent the next 24 hours preparing. She crafted new poi, reinforced with Kevlar wicks, soaked them carefully in fuel, checked her gear for safety. She selected an outfit that blended elegance with movement: black fitted pants, a crimson halter top, and a sheer wrap that would catch the firelight. Every step was measured, every choice deliberate. Her nerves buzzed like electricity, but she felt alive. When Saturday evening arrived, she arrived at the conservatory just after sunset. The building shimmered under a blanket of fairy lights, its glass panels glowing like a lantern in the dark. Guests in formal attire drifted through the entrance, laughter and music spilling onto the manicured lawn. Backstage, Ellie stood alone, breathing deeply, her hands trembling. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd. The event host introduced the performance as a special gift from the shadows of Charleston's coastline, and the lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the stage. Ellie stepped into the light. For a moment, silence reigned. Then she lit the poi, and flames leapt into life. She began to dance, not to impress, not to perform, but to express. Her body moved with the rhythm she had always known, the flames spinning arcs of gold and crimson, illuminating her skin and painting trails in the air. She was fire, wind, and ocean all at once. When it ended, the silence lingered for a heartbeat longer, before applause erupted like thunder. Ellie stood breathless, the poi extinguished at her sides, the heat still pulsing in her skin. She searched the crowd and found Dean standing near the back, smiling, not in triumph, but in awe. For the first time in her life, Ellie Porter was not invisible. She was incandescent. The morning after the gala, the streets of Charleston wore a hushed elegance, as if still recovering from the spectacle of the night before. Ellie woke not with regret or exhaustion, but with an aching fullness in her chest, like she had unlocked a door that could never be closed again. Her muscles were sore, her hair smelled faintly of smoke, and yet she moved through her apartment as if on air. It was the first morning she didn't feel like a ghost walking among relics. She had been seen, applauded, celebrated, not as an archivist, not as a quiet assistant in the shadows, but as herself. Word traveled fast. By the time she arrived at the museum on Monday, whispers followed her down the halls. Colleagues she had worked beside for years offered smiles, some curious, others approving. Mr. Langford gave her a long look before nodding once, muttering something about hidden talents as he passed. Ellie didn't crave attention, but something inside her glowed with quiet pride. She had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. Dean didn't contact her for 3 days. The silence felt both intentional and respectful. On the 4th evening, a message appeared in her inbox. "Lunch at the bookshop on Queen Street? Thought we might talk about what comes next." Ellie agreed, her heart already racing. The bookshop was tucked between a florist and a cafe, its wooden sign carved with ivy leaves and a name nearly worn away by time. Inside, it smelled of old paper and roasted coffee. Dean was already there, seated at a corner table with 2 mugs and a sandwich between them. "You've been hard to reach," he said as she sat down. "I've been processing," Ellie replied, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Understandable. That was one hell of a debut." She smiled faintly. It didn't feel like a debut. It felt like a confession. Dean studied her face. "I think that's what made it unforgettable." They sat in silence for a few moments before he leaned forward. "There's something I didn't mention before," he said, "about the ledger you found." Ellie straightened. "What about it?" "There's a note in the margins, just a few lines scribbled in faded ink. It didn't seem significant at first, but I've been digging, and I think it references a set of journals written by a freedwoman named Miriam Braithwaite. She lived just outside Charleston during Reconstruction. Her family kept records of safe houses and escape routes that predated the Civil War. Ellie's mind raced. "You think the ledger connects to those journals?" Dean nodded. "If we can find them, they might reveal a whole hidden network of resistance that's never been documented." Her archivist instincts surged to the surface. The thrill of discovery, the pull of untold stories waiting in shadows. It stirred something in her just as powerful as dancing did. "Where do we start?" she asked. "I have a lead. There's a historical society in Georgetown that acquired some of the Braithwaite estate papers 20 years ago. They might still have them." Ellie felt the pieces align in her mind. A new purpose formed, one that connected her love for history with her emerging courage to be seen. This was more than research. It was a journey into lives once erased by time, a way to illuminate forgotten truths. They arranged to visit the Georgetown Society the following Saturday. The rest of the week passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Ellie buried herself in archives during the day and practiced fire staff techniques at night. The two parts of her life no longer felt separate. For the first time, she was building a bridge between them. On the drive to Georgetown, the conversation flowed easily. Dean asked about her childhood, her first encounter with fire dancing, the reason she had kept it hidden for so long. Ellie answered with growing trust. She asked him about his journalism, how he had learned to see stories where others saw silence. "My mother was a teacher," he said, "taught me to listen for what wasn't being said." The Historical Society was housed in a weathered colonial mansion near the river, its white columns stained by time. Inside, a curator named Mr. Delaney greeted them with cautious hospitality. He led them through a narrow corridor to a storage room stacked with faded boxes. "These were part of a donation we received from the Braithwaite descendants," he explained. "We haven't had the resources to fully catalogue them. You're welcome to take a look." Ellie and Dean spent hours combing through the papers. Most were mundane, receipts, letters, photographs. But then Ellie found it. A leather-bound journal, brittle with age, the name Miriam Braithwaite etched on the inside cover. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first entry was dated March 5, 1861. "Tonight we passed 3 souls to the north wind. John lit the lantern at dusk, just as we planned. The marshes were thick with fog, but Miriam led them through with the surety of prayer." Ellie looked up at Dean, her eyes wide. "It's her. These are her words." They read together, breath held. The entries detailed names, places, coded instructions, maps drawn in ink and blood. The journals were a treasure of history, a testament to bravery and resilience. Ellie felt the weight of it like a sacred stone in her hands. As they left the building, Dean turned to her. "We need to share this, not just in print. This should be something people can feel." Ellie understood. She saw it clearly now, a performance not just for spectacle, but for remembrance. Fire dancing could become storytelling. The flames would not only mesmerize, they would illuminate lives once shrouded in silence. A new path unfolded before her, not just of discovery, but of purpose. Ellie was no longer just a woman with a secret. She was a vessel for voices long lost, a bearer of light for stories buried in the dark. Back in Charleston, Ellie walked through the museum's grand halls with new eyes. She no longer felt like a shadow moving through forgotten corridors. The discovery of Miriam Braithwaite's journal had shifted something permanent inside her. The words on those fragile pages, penned with care more than 150 years ago, had given her a mission that extended beyond archival duty. Miriam's story had survived time, silence, and dust. Now it deserved a voice, one as fierce and alive as the woman who had written it. Ellie spent the next days transcribing the journal by hand. She wanted to feel every curve of Miriam's script, to absorb the weight of each phrase. The journal chronicled months of activity, covert meetings in swamp cabins, coded signals sent through stitched quilts, a network of women guiding the lost like stars. Ellie was struck by how ordinary Miriam made the extraordinary seem. There was no flourish, no dramatization, only a quiet, determined will. The entries revealed a life spent in constant risk, and yet Miriam had found strength not just in survival, but in guiding others to it. Dean visited the museum every afternoon that week, bringing coffee and fresh eyes. They pored over the pages together, interpreting symbols, cross-referencing names with census records and mapping locations from memory and guesswork. Ellie found herself drawn deeper into the life behind the words. Miriam wasn't just a figure in a book. She was real, vivid, pulsing beneath the ink. It was like meeting someone in a dream and realizing they had been waiting all along. By Thursday evening, Ellie proposed something bold. She and Dean were in the reading room, surrounded by maps and photocopies, when she closed the journal gently and spoke. "This story doesn't belong in a display case," she said. "It needs to be told where people can feel it, see it, remember it." Dean leaned back, watching her carefully. "You're thinking about the fire dance?" She nodded. "Not just a dance, a reenactment, a performance that embodies what Miriam did, her journey, her courage, the fear, and the fire." Dean was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "It has to be perfect, honest, uncompromising." Ellie's mind was already racing. She envisioned a stage framed by candlelight, silhouettes moving through smoke, flames painting stories on the air, the rhythm of drums mimicking footsteps through marshes, a lantern held high guiding the lost, and above all the presence of Miriam, not as a historical name, but as a force resurrected in motion and light. They secured a venue within a week. The Magnolia Courtyard, a historic estate just outside the city, agreed to host the performance. It was a space steeped in history, its walls echoing with stories both remembered and suppressed. Ellie knew the weight of that choice. It wasn't just about ambience. It was about reclamation. Telling Miriam's story on land that once silenced voices like hers was an act of defiance, of tribute, of healing. Ellie recruited a small group of performers, all local dancers she had seen over the years in underground shows and midnight gatherings. Most of them knew her only as a quiet presence who watched from the edges. Now she stepped forward as a leader, choreographing with fire, sweat, and a clarity of vision none of them questioned. Rehearsals began at dusk and ran past midnight. The performers moved barefoot across the stone floor of the courtyard, learning to mirror the urgency and rhythm of Miriam's story. Each section of the performance was crafted to reflect a part of the journal: the escape, the crossing, the loss, the light. Ellie taught them not just movements, but meaning. Every gesture a word, every rotation of flame a sentence in a language older than ink. Her body ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from purpose. She had never spoken so much, led so confidently, or burned so fiercely. Dean attended every rehearsal, taking notes, documenting the process, but always keeping a respectful distance. He understood this was her story to tell, even if it came from another woman's past. Late one night, after the others had gone, Dean found Ellie alone in the courtyard. She was seated in the center, her poise still warm in her lap, her skin streaked with sweat and ash. He sat beside her without speaking for a while. Then he said, "I think you're doing something that matters." Ellie looked up, her eyes tired but luminous. So did she. They sat together in silence, surrounded by the echo of unspoken stories. The day of the performance arrived with storm clouds hanging low over the city. Ellie stood in the courtyard before sunrise, staring at the sky. She feared the rain would steal their fire, mute their voices. But by afternoon the clouds broke. The sun emerged timidly, casting golden light over the stone and ivy. Guests began to arrive just after dusk. Seats were arranged in a semicircle, facing a stage lined with lanterns and framed by old oaks. Ellie wore a simple dress of dark linen, her hair tied back, her expression solemn. This was not a spectacle, it was a ceremony. As the lights dimmed and the drums began, Ellie stepped into the firelight. The performance unfolded like a spell cast over the crowd. Flames spun like constellations, feet danced like whispers over water, arms reached like branches through night air. The audience sat in hushed awe as the story of Miriam Braithwaite came to life before them. Not in words, but in movement, in flame, in silence, broken only by breath and rhythm. The final scene ended with a single lantern raised high in Ellie's hand, her face lit from beneath, eyes fixed on the crowd. She stood like a sentinel, like Miriam must have stood so many nights, waiting for the next soul to follow the light. When the last drumbeat faded, no one clapped. Not at first. Then slowly, the applause rose, not raucous but reverent. Ellie stood still, letting it wash over her like rain. In that moment she felt it fully, the weight of the past, the fire of the present, and the promise of stories yet to be told. In the days following the performance at Magnolia Courtyard, Ellie found herself drawn into a whirlwind of reaction. Messages flooded her inbox, some from strangers moved by the performance, others from academics and historians eager to learn more about the Braithwaite Journal. The museum began fielding calls about potential exhibits, and a local television station requested an interview. Ellie declined most offers, choosing to focus on her work and her own fragile sense of peace. She was still adjusting to the feeling of being seen, not just by a crowd, but by history itself. Despite the praise, something in her remained cautious. The fire had been lit, but embers always carried risk. She knew that visibility could invite not only admiration, but scrutiny. Still, she continued transcribing Miriam's journal, line by line, determined to preserve every nuance, every name. The pages had grown more intimate, entries about fear, about a friend who had been caught and never returned, about the cost of being a guide. Ellie read each word as if it were being whispered directly to her, bridging centuries in silence. On a quiet Wednesday morning, as Charleston settled into its sticky summer rhythm, Ellie received an email from the Georgetown Historical Society. The message was brief, almost apologetic. "We've had a request for access to the Braithwaite documents. The party claims prior interest in the materials. Their credentials appear to check out. Just a courtesy notice." Ellie read the message 3 times, her stomach tightening. No name was mentioned, but something in the tone struck her as off. She forwarded it to Dean, who replied within minutes, asking to meet. They sat that afternoon in a small, windowless room in the back of the museum, the journal spread between them. Dean tapped the printed email. "I know who this is. His name is Leonard Grisham. He's an independent researcher with ties to a group that's been trying to discredit lesser-known historical narratives, especially those that challenge traditional accounts." Ellie frowned. "What does he want with Miriam's journal?" Dean hesitated. "He's written several papers arguing that the Underground Railroad in the South was largely a myth, exaggerated for political effect. If he gets access to this journal, he'll do everything he can to frame it as fabrication, or worse, irrelevant." The thought made Ellie's skin crawl. Miriam's words were sacred, etched in sweat and risk. To see them twisted or dismissed was unthinkable. "We have to stop him," she said quietly. Dean nodded. "I've already reached out to contacts in the preservation network. We'll have support. But Grisham is connected. If he can find a way to legally challenge the authenticity of the journal or imply it was doctored, he'll try." The next few days passed in a haze of urgency. Ellie and Dean began compiling a defense, documenting the journal's provenance, gathering expert testimonies, and cross-referencing Miriam's entries with other historical records. Each new connection strengthened the case for authenticity, but the looming threat remained. On Friday morning, Ellie arrived at the museum to find Mr. Langford waiting at her desk with a letter in hand. "This came for you," he said, frowning. The envelope was thick, the paper expensive. Inside was a formal notice. Leonard Grisham was requesting access to the Braithwaite materials for independent review, citing the Freedom of Information Act and recent public interest. Ellie sat down hard, the letter trembling in her hands. Dean read it over her shoulder. "He's trying to force the issue," he said. "We can't let him touch those pages," Ellie whispered. Dean placed a hand on the table. "Then we need to go public, not just with the performance, with everything, the full story. We release excerpts of the journal, backed by expert analysis. We make Miriam's voice louder than his attempts to silence it." It was a terrifying idea, but Ellie saw the sense in it. The best defense was not secrecy, but exposure. Light, once again, was their ally. They scheduled a press event at the museum for the following week. A panel of historians would present findings from the journal, contextualize its entries, and publicly affirm its significance. Ellie would speak as its discoverer and translator. The thought of standing before a crowd with that much at stake made her chest tighten, but she knew it had to be her. The night before the event, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the journal's final pages. One entry stood out. Miriam had written about the burning of a barn used to shelter escapees. She had returned to find ashes and silence, the air still warm from loss. But at the end of the entry she had written, "Ashes don't forget, they hold the shape of the fire." Ellie copied the line onto a piece of paper and folded it into her pocket. The next morning, She pinned it inside her jacket before leaving for the museum. The press event drew a larger crowd than expected. Cameras flashed, journalists filled the aisles, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Mr. Langford introduced the panel, and the historians spoke first, outlining the journal's authenticity, the historical corroboration, and the broader significance of Miriam Braithwaite's role. Then it was Ellie's turn. She stepped to the podium, her hands steady, her breath calm. She looked at the crowd and began to speak, not with rehearsed polish, but with quiet conviction. She told them about finding the journal, about the weight of Miriam's words, about the fire that had shaped her life. She read the entry about the lantern, about loss, about courage in the face of darkness. Then she spoke the line she had folded in her pocket. Ashes don't forget. They hold the shape of the fire. The room was silent, then stirred with slow, rising applause. After the event, as reporters approached and questions poured in, Ellie caught sight of a man standing near the exit. He was tall, with a trimmed beard and sharp eyes that didn't blink often. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. Dean noticed him too. "That's Grisham," he said under his breath. Ellie stared back at the man, unflinching. The fire had been lit. Let him come. The press event had been a public triumph, but Ellie felt the weight of its aftermath settle around her like a second skin. Though the historians had confirmed the authenticity of Miriam Braithwaite's journal, and Ellie's translation had moved many to tears, she knew the victory would not go unchallenged. Leonard Grisham's presence at the event had not been accidental. He had been watching, studying, waiting for his moment. She had seen it in the way his eyes scanned the room, how his fingers never left the small leather notebook he held at his side. 3 days later, his response arrived. An opinion article published in a major Charleston newspaper, front page of the culture section, titled with quiet venom, "Romanticizing Fire When Myth Clouds Memory." Grisham never mentioned Ellie or the journal by name, but the target was unmistakable. He called the performance well-intentioned theater, implying that stories like Miriam's were built more on modern narratives than verifiable history. He questioned the motivations behind resurrecting marginal figures from fragmented records, and suggested that memory, when tied too tightly to art, became dangerous fiction. The reaction was swift and divided. Supporters of Ellie and the journal flooded online comment sections with praise and indignation, but Grisham had allies, old-school academics who feared the disruption of comfortable timelines, and skeptics who clung to control over historical truth. The tone of the discourse shifted. What had been reverence began to crack under suspicion. Ellie did not respond publicly. Instead, she doubled her efforts behind the scenes. She worked with Dean and the museum's research department to prepare a full digital archive of the journal, complete with annotations, cross-references, and a timeline of known Underground Railroad activity in the South. The goal was not to argue, but to present facts. Miriam's words, untouched, allowed to speak for themselves. Yet despite their work, Ellie could feel the tide pulling at her. She began to receive anonymous messages, some accusatory, some mocking. One email, sent from an untraceable account, included a scanned copy of an 1871 census page with a note scribbled at the bottom. "No Miriam Braithwaite listed. Check your ghosts." Dean advised caution, but Ellie refused to stop. She returned to the original source material, confirmed the journal's chain of custody, verified Miriam's name in a land deed tucked between the back pages. Miriam had existed. She had written the words. The absence of a census entry proved nothing. Records from that era were notoriously inconsistent, especially for freed black women navigating Reconstruction. One evening, while Ellie was working late at the museum, she heard the creak of a door behind her. She turned to find the night security guard frowning. "You expecting anyone?" he asked. She shook her head. "Someone just came in through the side entrance, said they had permission to drop off documents." Seemed odd. Ellie followed him to the staff hallway. A manila envelope sat on the floor beneath the coat rack. Inside, Ellie found a stack of photocopied letters and clippings, documents that appeared to discredit the Braithwaite family's claim to the estate. Most were badly sourced or irrelevant, but at the bottom was a typed letter addressed to the custodian of memory. It read, "History belongs to those who protect its truth, not to dancers, dreamers, or storytellers. You've crossed into myth." Step back before the fire consumes you. There was no signature. She showed the letter to Dean, who read it twice before speaking. "He's not going to stop," he said. "But neither should you." Ellie didn't sleep that night. She paced her apartment, the words of the letter echoing in her mind. She wasn't afraid of Grisham, not in the usual sense, but she feared what his influence could do to the fragile truth they had uncovered. Lies were easier to believe than the kind of truth that challenged comfort, and he was skilled at making lies sound like reason. The next morning she returned to Folly Beach. She hadn't danced there since before the gala. The tide was low, the sky streaked with grey, the sand cool beneath her feet. She lit her poi and began to move, not for an audience, not for validation, but to remember why she had started. The flames spun around her like memory made flesh, and for a while she let herself vanish into the motion. Afterward, as the fire burned low, Ellie stared out at the horizon and made a decision. She would host a second performance, not to defend herself, but to deepen the story. The first dance had introduced Miriam to the world. The second would reveal her journey, her losses, her strength, her persistence beyond the page. Dean was hesitant at first. The backlash had made everything more volatile, but Ellie's conviction was unwavering. "We can't let them take this away," she said. "We owe her more than silence." They chose a new venue, a decommissioned church that had once served as a refuge for travelers and fugitives during Reconstruction. The building had been abandoned for years, its wooden beams scorched by time, its stained glass windows cracked but still brilliant when caught by the sun. It was perfect. Rehearsals resumed with a new cast. Ellie invited dancers from diverse backgrounds, including descendants of families connected to the Underground Railroad. This time, the choreography was heavier, slower, echoing the weight of loss and the quiet endurance of survival. The fire was not just a symbol of light, but of destruction and rebirth. She included passages from Miriam's later entries, recited by voices off stage. Words that spoke of betrayal, of a safe house burned, of a child separated from her mother and never seen again. The performance would not comfort. It would confront. As word of the second event spread, tensions rose. The museum received a formal complaint from a local heritage group alleging historical sensationalism. Dean's editor was pressured to pull funding for a related article. Even some of Ellie's colleagues grew distant. But amidst the noise, support grew too. Local activists, artists, and historians rallied around her. Donations arrived anonymously. An online campaign shared excerpts of Miriam's journal alongside modern testimonials. The flame had caught, and Ellie stood at the center, no longer invisible, no longer afraid. The church stood silent under a bruised twilight sky, its wooden frame silhouetted against the last fading light of day. Once a sanctuary for the displaced and the hunted, it now waited to serve again. Ellie arrived just after sunset, her gear slung over her shoulder, her body humming with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The others were already there, arranging lanterns, checking fuel, laying mats over the warped floorboards. The interior smelled of dust and memory, the scent of wood smoke still faint in the air from decades past. It was not a polished venue, not built for spectacle, but it pulsed with a deeper truth. This performance was not advertised broadly. Word had spread through whispered networks, through trust. No cameras were permitted. The space was sacred. The story would be passed not through media, but through presence. Those who came would carry it forward in voice and memory. Ellie walked the stage in silence before the others arrived. She traced the path she would take, from the far corner where the journey began, to the center where the fire would rise, to the makeshift altar of stones where the final light would rest. Every movement had been practiced, refined, stripped of excess. There was no room for decoration, only essence. Dean stood in the back, watching without interference. He had become her quiet anchor, present but not intrusive. His notebook remained closed. He understood that this performance, unlike the first, was not about observation. It was about transformation. The performers gathered in a circle before the start. There were 9 of them, each holding a different flame-bearing tool. Poi, staff, fans, torches. They stood in reverent silence as Ellie spoke. "This is not for applause," she said. "This is not a show. It's a return, a reminder, a promise." She held Miriam's journal in her hands. Not the original, it remained locked safely in the museum, but a copy she had made by hand, page by page, word by word. She placed it at the center of the circle. A single lantern was lit beside it. "Let her speak," Ellie whispered. The lights dimmed. The air grew still. The doors creaked closed behind the last arriving guest. Then the drums began. Slow at first, low, deliberate, like the sound of a distant heartbeat. The performers moved through the space like shadows, each carrying flame that flickered and bowed, as if acknowledging the ghosts that filled the room. Ellie entered last, her face bare, her body marked with ash in the shape of 3 lines: past, present, future. She began to move with the rhythm of the journal entries. Each motion traced a moment from Miriam's writing: the cautious opening of a hidden door, the hush of breath as patrols passed, the swift urgency of feet crossing marshland. Her poi ignited, circles of fire carving paths into the dark. The flames didn't dance, they told. They mourned, they remembered. At key moments, voices echoed from the edges of the room, recorded readings from the journal layered with live recitation. A woman's voice reading, "We lost another last night. He ran too early, the light was not in place. I lit my own after, though it was not my turn." Then silence, then movement. The audience sat motionless, some with hands clasped, others with tears already streaking their cheeks. The performance was not linear. It looped and spiraled, reflecting the way trauma repeats across generations. There were moments of stillness when all the flames died, and only breath remained. There were moments when every performer lit their torches and formed a ring of fire, enclosing Ellie in a circle of light and history. In the final act, Ellie stepped forward alone, carrying a single torch. She approached the altar of stones, knelt, and laid the flame down. The room darkened again. Only the journal remained visible, bathed in soft amber light. Then Ellie spoke, not from a script, but from herself. She was not a myth. She was not a symbol. She was a woman. She was light in the dark, and they tried to bury her. But she wrote, and we remembered. No music followed, no curtain closed. The silence held. The audience rose not in ovation, but in quiet reverence. Some approached the altar not to touch, but to stand near it, as if proximity might carry memory through skin. Others filed out wordlessly, their footsteps soft on the worn wood floor. Dean waited outside. Ellie joined him only after the last dancer had extinguished the final flame. Her hands were still warm. Her body ached in ways that had nothing to do with movement. He looked at her, then down at the journal in her hands. "She saw you coming," he said. Ellie didn't reply. The air around her was thick with something unspoken, something sacred, but she knew he was right. Later that night, as the others packed and swept and whispered goodbyes, Ellie stood alone in the courtyard behind the church. The stars above were faint, veiled by the humid sky, but she lifted her gaze anyway. Miriam had once stood beneath that same sky, lighting a lantern, not knowing who would see it, not knowing if it would be the last thing she ever did. She had moved forward without certainty, guided only by faith and fire. Ellie understood now what that meant. This performance would not end the resistance. Grisham would still publish, doubts would still rise, but Ellie had lit a second flame, and someone, somewhere, would carry it forward. 3 days after the second performance, the museum's archive room was broken into. The morning light hadn't yet reached the upper galleries when Ellie arrived and found the side door to the archives ajar. At first, she thought perhaps a custodian had forgotten to lock it properly, but when she stepped inside, the cold that met her wasn't just from the climate control. The overhead lights flickered, and 2 file drawers had been pulled out and left open. On the table where she had last worked, the space was clean, too clean. The copy of Miriam Braithwaite's journal was gone. She stood still for several moments, unable to process what she was seeing. Then her breath returned with a rush. She moved methodically, checking every drawer, every shelf. The original was still locked in its temperature-controlled case in the back vault, untouched. But the annotated copy, the one she had poured hours into, which included marginalia, cross-references, even potential descendant notes, had vanished. She notified museum security. Surveillance footage showed a figure, masked and wearing gloves, entering at 2:30 in the morning, disabling the internal cameras near the archive hall. The footage ended there. The intruder had come for one thing. By noon, the museum was in lockdown. Dean arrived shortly after, his face grim. She showed him the empty space where the journal copy had sat. They knew exactly what they were looking for, she said. He rubbed his jaw, thinking, "You kept digital backups?" "Yes, but this was the annotated version. It included details not in the public release yet. Connections we hadn't fully verified. It could be manipulated." Dean's expression darkened. "Or buried." That same day, an anonymous post began circulating online. A grainy image of one of the journal's pages, taken out of context and marked with red circles, as if to highlight supposed inconsistencies. The post included vague accusations of historical fabrication, suggesting that the language used in the journal didn't align with regional dialects of the period. It claimed the handwriting showed suspicious modernisms and accused Ellie indirectly of either misrepresenting the journal or participating in a carefully orchestrated hoax. The platform hosting the post refused to take it down, citing freedom of inquiry. Comment sections flooded with speculation, some users offering amateur handwriting analyses, others claiming personal knowledge of historical forgeries. Ellie's name began trending in niche forums, tied to terms like revisionist fraud and curated mythology. The digital tide turned harsh, fast, and personal. That night, she found her apartment's front door vandalized. A strip of paper had been taped across it, scrawled in heavy marker, "Truth isn't yours to invent." She didn't call the police. She sat on the steps instead, the paper balled in her hand, and stared at the dark street. Dean joined her 20 minutes later, having come straight from a meeting with the museum board. "They're nervous," he said, lowering himself beside her. "Some want to distance the institution from the journal, at least until the accusations die down." Ellie exhaled slowly. "Of course they do. We'll fight it. We have provenance, we have support. But it's not about what's real anymore. It's about what people want to believe." She leaned back against the railing. "Miriam was erased once. I won't let it happen again." The following day, she organized a closed meeting with the museum board. She came prepared, not with speeches, but with evidence. She presented the original journal, untouched and preserved, and cross-referenced entries with external documents, land deeds, court records, receipts from a general store where Miriam had once purchased goods for the travelers. She showed how certain names matched those found in abolitionist correspondence. Every line of attack was answered with research. Still, some board members remained cautious. "You understand," one of them said, adjusting his tie. "It's not just about truth, it's about optics. The museum has a reputation to protect." Ellie stared at him. "So does history." She left the meeting without waiting for a vote. Outside, Dean waited with news. A small local university had reached out. One of their history professors, a black woman named Dr. Althea Morris, had seen the second performance and had begun an independent study of the journal. She believed the backlash was part of a larger pattern, an organized effort to delegitimize emerging narratives of black resistance in the American South. She offered to help. That night, Ellie met with Dr. Morris in a dim cafe near the waterfront. The professor brought copies of court filings from other cases, similar attempts to undermine newly discovered historical texts. She outlined a strategy: academic publication, public readings, and an open-source research coalition that could vet and verify every piece of Miriam's journal in transparent collaboration. "You can't fight shadows alone," Dr. Morris said. "We turn on the light together." Ellie nodded. For the first time in days, her fear gave way to determination. She returned home and opened her laptop. She uploaded every scan of the journal, every transcript, every annotation to a new online archive. Then she wrote a statement, plain and honest, and posted it alongside the files. "If you want to question the truth, begin here. But understand, this isn't my story. I'm only the voice that found it." Within 48 hours, over 10,000 people had accessed the archive. Historians began contributing comments, clarifying terms, offering insight into dialect, validating maps. A counter-narrative formed, not to silence criticism, but to meet it with clarity and community. Leonard Grisham, when contacted for a response, declined to comment. But new posts under his name began to appear less frequently and with less traction. The attempt to erase had backfired. Ellie sat in the museum archive one evening, the real journal open before her, lit by a single desk lamp. She traced her finger over the ink, now so familiar it felt like a part of her. Miriam had once written, "If they cannot find the path, we must leave markers in the trees." Ellie whispered to the silence, "We found them." The weeks following the digital release of Miriam Braithwaite's journal became a whirlwind of clarity and connection. What had started as a solitary effort between Ellie and Dean evolved into a movement far larger than either of them had anticipated. Dozens of historians, archivists, and cultural scholars from across the country contributed to the open archive. They brought with them not just validation, but an energy Ellie had never felt in the academic world, a kind of urgent reverence, as though the truth had been waiting too long and would wait no more. New voices joined the conversation. A poet from New Orleans published a collection inspired by Miriam's entries. A theater director from Richmond reached out with interest in staging a dramatic adaptation based on the journal. Even a group of middle school students in Maryland studying Reconstruction history began a podcast called Miriam's Light, exploring each of her passages in dialogue with current events. Ellie listened to one of their episodes late one evening. A girl with a shy voice had read from the entry about Miriam lighting a lantern during a thunderstorm. Her interpretation, honest and clear, concluded, "I think she was scared, but she still lit it. That's what makes her brave." The simplicity of the statement stayed with Ellie. At the museum, things had shifted too. Mr. Langford, once cautious, now became one of the journal's public advocates, citing its impact during donor meetings and speaking at community events. A new exhibit was proposed, one not just featuring Miriam's journal but curated with an interactive timeline, oral histories from modern descendants, and fire motifs embedded in the design. Ellie was asked to lead its development. She accepted under one condition, that the exhibit remain open source and continually evolving, just like the journal's legacy. Dean, meanwhile, had begun writing a full-length feature series for national publication. His approach was not to profile Ellie or glorify the controversy, but to tell the story through its center, Miriam herself. He combed through census anomalies, traced maps from the journal, interviewed local families whose ancestors had lived near the Braithwaite land. What emerged wasn't just a feature, it was a reclamation. A lost piece of American memory pulled gently back into the light. But for all the growth and celebration, Ellie remained aware of the fragility behind it. Public support was fickle. Truth, even when proven, did not always silence the loudest voices. Grisham had gone quiet, but not disappeared. Rumors circulated that he was preparing a book challenging the rise of emotional historical narratives, a veiled continuation of his attack. Ellie no longer feared him, but she respected the danger of his methods. Erasure often wore the mask of reason. She returned to the beach one night, the first time since the second performance. The tide was high, and the moon cast silver veins across the waves. She brought her poi but didn't light them. Instead, she stood barefoot on the cold sand, listening to the sea. The wind carried memories of that first night Dean had seen her, of the silence before the flame, of the words that had changed everything. "Ashes don't forget." She closed her eyes and whispered, "Neither do I." The next morning, Ellie received a letter, this time not anonymous. It was handwritten in neat cursive, postmarked from Savannah. "I saw your performance. My grandmother was born on the edge of the Braithwaite land. She told me stories once, stories I didn't understand until I heard Miriam's name. Thank you for giving her back to us." Beneath the signature was a photograph, faded and sepia-toned. It showed two women in aprons standing beside a hand-carved door. Behind them, barely visible, was a quilt hung from a line. The patterns matched one of the codes described in Miriam's journal. Ellie framed the photo and placed it beside her desk at the museum. Days grew warmer. Spring settled over Charleston, and the courtyard where Ellie had once performed filled with new blossoms. The museum prepared to unveil the Braithwaite exhibit. Ellie, working late one night, found herself alone in the archive once more. She opened the original journal, turned to the final entry and reread it aloud. "The road ahead is dark, but I leave the light as best I can, not for myself, for the ones who come next. If you are reading this, you are already part of it. Carry the fire. Do not forget." She paused, her voice unsteady. Then she wrote beneath the last line in pencil so faint it would fade with time, "I will." A few weeks later, on the night of the exhibit's opening, Ellie stood beside Dean as guests filtered through the museum halls. The display was subtle, powerful, alive. Miriam's journal sat at the center, surrounded by lanterns suspended at varying heights. Visitors moved through the space like pilgrims, some pausing to read, others to cry. A child asked if the flames were real. Her father smiled and said, "Yes, just in a different way." Near the end of the evening, Dr. Morris approached Ellie. They exchanged quiet greetings, then stood together before the journal. "She would be proud," the professor said. Ellie nodded. "I hope she knows." She does. Outside, the city glowed. Fire danced in electric bulbs, in candle-lit windows, in the eyes of those who remembered. Ellie no longer walked in shadow. Her voice, once silent, now moved through others, students, dancers, teachers, elders, all carrying the same spark. And Miriam, written into history not as a footnote but as a beacon, continued to shine. The exhibit had been open for 3 weeks when Ellie received an invitation that stopped her breath short. It came not from a local group or museum, but from the National Archive Commission in Washington, D.C. They were organizing a symposium on forgotten histories of the American South and requested her presence as both a speaker and performer. Her name was listed alongside renowned scholars, curators, and cultural leaders. The letter mentioned the Braithwaite Journal by name, calling it a touchstone for ethical memory work. Ellie reread the letter under the dim light of her kitchen lamp. She traced the words with her finger, not to confirm their presence, but to feel them against her skin. Even after all that had happened, part of her still struggled to reconcile the quiet woman who once danced alone on a moonlit beach with the voice now requested on a national stage. She accepted the invitation, though not without hesitation. Dean, upon hearing the news, only smiled. "They're not asking for a performer," he said. "They're asking for the woman who refused to let a voice go unheard." Preparations began almost immediately. The symposium would span 4 days, with Ellie scheduled to speak on the second afternoon and perform on the final night. The theme of her panel was narrative resistance, and she was expected to address not just the discovery of Miriam's journal, but the cultural implications of reclaiming erased histories through art. For the performance, she was given freedom, any space, any method. Ellie chose not to bring others with her. This was something she needed to do alone. She arrived in Washington a day before the symposium began. The city buzzed with noise and movement, far removed from Charleston's slow rhythm. The archive building stood massive and marble white, its columns flanked by banners announcing the event. Inside, she was given a quiet room to prepare, a stage to inspect, and a moment to sit alone with her thoughts. She brought the original journal with her, not to display, but to hold. It had become less an artifact and more a companion, a tether to a truth too sacred to leave behind. Her panel was well attended. Scholars leaned forward in their seats, some already familiar with the journal, others hearing of it for the first time. Ellie spoke without notes. She told the story plainly, how she found the ledger, how she followed the names, how Miriam's voice emerged like a thread pulled from the earth. She explained the performances not as interpretations, but as invitations, ways to let the past breathe in a form modern hearts could receive. She ended her talk with Miriam's line, "Ashes don't forget. They hold the shape of the fire." The room stood in silence for several seconds before applause rippled through it, rising with a gravity that felt earned, not given. Afterward, a woman approached her in the hallway. Middle-aged, sharply dressed, eyes soft behind glasses. "My name is Ruth Braithwaite," she said. "My family lost track of its own story 3 generations ago, but your work brought part of it back. I don't know if Miriam is my ancestor, but I'd like to believe she's in my blood somewhere." Ellie took her hand. "She's in all of us now." The final night arrived with a storm brewing outside the city. Rain tapped against the windows as guests gathered in the glass-enclosed atrium of the archive, a space designed for acoustics and reflection. Ellie wore black, her arms bare, her hair tied back. The poi were ready, soaked and prepped. The lights dimmed. A recording began to play, Miriam's words, read by Ellie herself. "They said we should not leave marks, that we should vanish like mist. But I planted fire where their eyes could not go, and someone will follow it." Then silence. then motion. Ellie stepped into the center of the atrium and lit the poi. The flames arced into life, soft and steady at first, then growing as her body moved. The space filled with orange and gold, reflections dancing across the marble floor and the high windows above. She danced not as a symbol, but as a vessel. Every movement drew on the entries, the risks, the escapes, the courage embedded in Miriam's life. This time, the choreography wasn't pre-planned. Ellie let the fire guide her. She moved with instinct, not routine. She let the journal's weight settle in her spine, her shoulders, her breath, and through it something happened that she hadn't felt before. Not just presence, but transference. It was as if Miriam herself stood behind her, their movements overlapping across time. The performance ended with Ellie holding the poi still, flames reduced to soft embers. She knelt, head bowed, and let the silence speak. No music followed, only breath, only memory. When she stood, the audience remained seated, still held in the gravity of what they'd witnessed. Some wiped tears, others simply closed their eyes as if afraid to let go of the moment too soon. Outside, the storm had broken. Rain streaked the atrium glass, and thunder rolled across the city like the echo of something ancient stirring beneath it all. That night, Ellie walked alone through the quiet streets of Washington, her body cooled by the wind, her heart full of something more than pride. She felt expanded, as if she were no longer one but many, as if Miriam's voice now lived through hundreds, thousands, echoing through fire and time and courage. Back in Charleston a week later, she returned to Folly Beach. The moon was high again, the sand cold. She lit the poi one more time, not for an audience, not for remembrance, but for continuation. And as the flames rose, she whispered into the sea breeze, "We're still here." In the weeks following the symposium in Washington, Ellie returned to her routines, but nothing about her world was the same. The city of Charleston, once a backdrop for her quiet existence, now seemed to hum with recognition. Faces on the street lingered longer. Voices at the museum softened when they addressed her. Some asked for updates on Miriam's story, others simply offered a nod of quiet respect. Ellie didn't seek attention, but she no longer shrank from it. She had crossed the threshold between witness and bearer. The Braithwaite exhibit continued to draw visitors. School groups toured the gallery daily, guided by docents trained with care. Children stood before the journal's replica, tracing the faded words with their eyes, asking questions their teachers hadn't prepared for. The museum began gathering oral responses, video reflections recorded by visitors about what Miriam's story meant to them. The responses, ranging from whispered awe to passionate declarations, were compiled and played on a loop in a small side chamber titled The Echo Room. It was in this room, one quiet afternoon, that Ellie met a woman who changed everything again. She was elderly, with skin like carved walnut and hands that trembled just slightly. Her name was Mabel King. She wore a brooch that caught Ellie's eye immediately, an antique brass lantern. "You probably don't remember me," she said as Ellie entered the room, "but I remember you. I saw your first dance, the one on the beach, long before the lights and exhibits." Ellie blinked, surprised. "You were there?" Mabel nodded. "From a distance. I walk the beach some nights. That evening I saw your fire through the dune grass. I didn't interrupt. I watched." They sat together in the small bench alcove beside the recordings. Mabel pulled a worn notebook from her purse. "My mother used to tell me a story about a woman named Miriam. Said she helped her grandfather find his way out of danger one night. I never had anything to prove it, just her voice and this." She handed Ellie the notebook. Inside were pages of names, dates, and notes passed down from memory. One page near the center bore the words Braithwaite Marshlight, circled in faded pencil. The handwriting matched the ledger Ellie had first discovered months before. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes before she could stop them. "I always wondered if it was real," Mabel said. "When I saw the exhibit, I knew it had to be. You found her." Ellie held the notebook carefully, reverently. "We found her," Mabel smiled. "Beneath every silence, there's a voice waiting to be heard. You just happened to be the one who listened." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, the notebook beside her, and read through every entry. The notes were patchwork, the dates loose, but the pattern was unmistakable. Miriam's light had traveled farther than anyone had realized. Her reach had extended into families, oral traditions, lives that now saw themselves in her story. Ellie called Dean the next morning. "There's more," she said, "not just in the journal, in memory, in the people who carried it unknowingly." Dean met her at the museum, his eyes sharp with interest. "We start collecting them," he said. They launched a new phase of the project, the Hidden Threads Archive. Its purpose was simple: gather stories, documents, oral histories, fragments that might connect to the Braithwaite network or similar forgotten histories. Submissions poured in from across the South. Some were brief: a name remembered by a great-grandmother, a photograph of a stranger who once lived near an old trail. Others were more detailed: entire family trees traced back to whispers and warnings passed down in kitchens and porches. Patterns began to form, codes repeated, lanterns described in multiple accounts, a series of quilts stitched with nearly identical symbols appearing in households separated by hundreds of miles. Ellie worked tirelessly, drawing the connections, mapping them by hand at first, then digitally. The network wasn't just Miriam's. It was a web of resistance, of quiet courage woven across generations. What had begun with one journal now reached through an entire constellation of memory. But Ellie knew this expansion came with new challenges. The more visible they became, the more pressure built around the project's integrity. Already, conservative critics were questioning the methodology. A columnist in a regional journal accused her of emotional archaeology, claiming that memory could not be equated with fact. She didn't answer publicly, but she documented everything. She made every source traceable, every story transparent. She invited review, welcomed collaboration. In the face of doubt, she let clarity be her defiance. Late one evening, she sat alone in the museum, surrounded by notes and maps and copies of the submissions. The original journal remained locked in its case, illuminated softly by a dedicated lamp. She approached it now and knelt before the glass. For a moment, she rested her forehead against the cool surface. "I hear them," she whispered. In that silence, she felt the weight and warmth of every story shared, every fire lit in the dark. The next day, she drafted a new preface for the second edition of the Braithwaite Journal. It read, "This is not just a record, it is a resonance." Fire carried in hands that never held paper, a truth spoken in tongues never caught by historians. What we hold now is not the end of a story, but its release. May every silence guide you to its source. The Braithwaite exhibit entered its 6th month with record attendance. Visitors came not just from Charleston but from across the country, teachers with their students, elders with their grandchildren, travelers who had once only heard whispers of the Underground Railroad's southern reach. The museum had never hosted an installation that felt so alive, so deeply participatory. The space changed daily. New contributions from the Hidden Threads archive were added to a growing digital wall of names, stories, and images. Visitors left written reflections on slips of paper pinned beside the journal's glass case, forming a mosaic of grief, gratitude, and resolve. Ellie moved through this space every day, like a guardian tending a living flame. Her role had evolved beyond archivist, beyond dancer, even beyond storyteller. She had become a steward of memory, of a truth too long hidden, now too luminous to suppress. But with visibility came decisions. The more the project grew, the more people looked to her for direction. She had once feared the spotlight. Now it followed her wherever she went. The museum board, flush with success and positive press, approached her with a proposal. They wanted to create a permanent wing, dedicated to forgotten resistance movements throughout American history, beginning with Miriam's story. It would be the largest institutional investment in Ellie's career, a long-term commitment that would require her to stay in Charleston, to guide the curation, to expand the network. Ellie took the proposal home and stared at it for hours. She thought about the quiet years before all of this, about dancing alone on the beach, about cataloguing dusty manuscripts with no one watching. That life had been safe, but it had also been unfinished. Dean, sensing her hesitation, met her that evening at a quiet rooftop bar. The air was warm, the horizon painted with the last blush of sunlight. "You've already built the flame," he said. "You don't have to carry it alone, but you do have to choose where to plant it." She looked at him, tired and clear-eyed. "I'm not sure staying is the right way to grow it. Dean nodded, not surprised. Then we take it further. The next week, Ellie stood before a smaller, more intimate audience at a community center in Montgomery, Alabama. She had traveled there not as a guest of a national institution, but as part of a grassroots invitation from a local history initiative. These weren't donors or journalists. They were descendants, teachers, church elders, people who had lived in the margins of historical narratives their whole lives. She shared Miriam's story, read from the journal, danced in a narrow circle of lanterns held by children who had memorized her words. It wasn't grand, but it was true. This, she realized, was where the legacy belonged, not enclosed in glass, but passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. She began a journey that lasted months. New Orleans, Atlanta, Richmond, Savannah. In each city, Ellie brought the journal, not the original, but a traveling replica, and performed under open skies, in churches, in school gyms. She collected stories as she went, building the Hidden Threads archive into a national repository. Dean documented the journey, turning his feature series into a book titled Flamekeeper, How One Woman Recovered the Voice of Resistance. It would go on to be taught in university courses across the country. Back in Charleston, the permanent exhibit was built without her daily presence, guided by her frameworks and expanded by a team she had trained. The museum named the new wing the Braithwaite Room. At its center was a single, continuous flame burning behind a glass orb, lit during the wing's dedication and never extinguished. Ellie returned for the dedication ceremony. The mayor spoke. Dr. Morris spoke. Dean read from the book. When Ellie stepped up, she carried with her a small wooden box. She opened it, revealing a piece of quilt stitched with one of the codes from Miriam's journal. This, she said, holding it high, was never meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be passed on. Then she placed it beside the journal case and stepped back. That evening, a final performance was held in the museum courtyard. No stage, no microphones, just a circle of people, old and young, black and white, quiet and singing. Ellie lit the poi for what she believed might be the last public time. She danced not with sorrow or urgency, but with completion. The fire spun in slow, deliberate arcs, not to dazzle, not to resist, to honor. When the flames dimmed, she held the poi still, lowered them, and bowed. The crowd, hushed in reverence, responded not with applause but with a song, a spiritual, soft and rising, sung by a grandmother who had traveled from Louisiana with her grandson. Others joined. The sound filled the courtyard and spilled into the Charleston night, rising like incense. Later, as Ellie walked alone through the city's cobblestone streets, she realized the fire had done what she had hoped. It had moved beyond her. It would now live in classrooms, in hearts, in conversations whispered across tables. Miriam's voice had not only survived, it had taken root. Months passed, and the fire Ellie had ignited continued to move outward. What had once lived in the margins of a museum archive now pulsed through schools, libraries, oral history projects, and stages across the country. Miriam Braithwaite's name had been etched into the public consciousness, not through myth, but through presence, held firmly in the arms of those who refused to let her disappear again. Ellie found herself returning less frequently to Charleston, not out of distance, but because her work had evolved beyond a single place. She had become something of a traveling keeper, not of a single story, but of many. The threads uncovered through the archive wove together a tapestry of hidden resistance and perseverance that defied the neat borders of any map. In Detroit, she listened to descendants share coded songs once sung in factories. In El Paso, a woman told her about her great-grandfather who sheltered runaways in the hollows beneath his chapel floor. In each voice, Ellie heard echoes of the same fire. Her performances became rarer, less choreographed, more instinctive. She now danced when the moment called for it. At vigils, at story circles, at events where words could no longer carry the weight of memory. The poi had aged with her, charred slightly at the handles, the fabric darkened by hundreds of flames. She carried them always, wrapped in cloth inside a cedar box lined with ash. On a warm spring evening, nearly a year after the first unveiling of the Braithwaite Journal, Ellie received a letter. It bore the seal of the Smithsonian Institution and contained a request. They were planning a national exhibition titled The Fire We Carried, dedicated to cultural memory, resistance through art, and hidden histories told through performance. They asked if she would consider donating the poi to the collection. She read the letter 3 times, her fingers resting on the words. To give them up would be to mark an end. To place them behind glass meant letting them stop moving. But it also meant preservation, honor, continuation in a different form. That night, she walked to Folly Beach, the sky above her streaked with stars. The wind came in low and warm. She didn't dance, she didn't light the poi. She simply stood at the edge of the water, letting the memory of her first flames rise in the quiet between waves. She made her decision the following morning. She wrote to the Smithsonian, agreeing to the donation on one condition, that the poi be displayed beside a copy of Miriam's journal, and that both be titled The Unforgotten Flame. The exhibit launched that fall. Visitors moved through rooms filled with artifacts of rebellion and remembrance. Music, textiles, letters, tools turned into instruments of survival. In the center stood Ellie's poi, suspended above a circle of stone, and across from them, the journal opened to Miriam's final entry. A plaque explained their story, their convergence, their legacy. Children stood wide-eyed beneath the flame-scarred cords. Elders wept quietly beside the glass. Ellie attended the opening but remained in the crowd, unnoticed by most. She wanted to see it as others did, without expectation. A young girl stood near the poi, reading aloud from the journal. Her voice trembled slightly but grew steadier with each line. When she finished, she looked up at her mother. She was brave, she said. Her mother replied, "So are you." Outside the museum, the air was thick with the scent of rain and possibility. Dean met Ellie at the steps, now working as a cultural correspondent, his book translated into 3 languages. They walked in silence, no longer needing words to understand what had been built between them. Partnership, respect, something forged not through romance, but through purpose. "Do you think it will last?" Dean finally asked. Ellie looked up at the sky. Truth always lasts. What we do with it, that's the flame. She returned to Charleston weeks later, not to stay but to visit. The Braithwaite Room had grown. A new section featured recent submissions to the Hidden Threads archive. Students from South Carolina had traced 3 new routes used by freedom seekers, each supported by local folklore and land records. A historian from Maine contributed a map revealing a series of coded letters embedded in sermons. The exhibit was no longer static. It was alive. In a quiet corner beside the original journal, someone had added a small plaque, not officially part of the installation. It read, "She danced where history was silent. She carried the light. She left it burning." Ellie stood before it for a long time. Then she turned and walked out into the golden afternoon. She no longer needed the fire in her hands. It was in the world now, in the pages read, in the voices remembered, in the footsteps taken by those who would never again be unseen. And so the flame lived on, not in ashes, not in performance, but in story. The unforgotten flame,